In this video, I'm going to take a few moments to briefly look at the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I call this a brief look because it's not going to be exhaustive. What I want to do is give you some of the basic reasons why I think that it's credible for Christians to believe that after Jesus was crucified on the cross, 3 days later, he rose bodily from the dead. And so I want to give you some of the reasons why I think this is rational for us to believe, at least from a historical perspective. Now, if you're interested in some of this material and you want to look further, there really are an abundance of resources out there that you could look into. I'm just going to mention a few here. By way of introduction, I would very much recommend Lee Strobel's classic book, The Case for Christ. Now, this book is a book that I read when I was in college. And I found that it was very helpful for me as I was trying to figure out not just what I believe as a Christian, but I was trying to figure out whether or not there were good reasons for me to believe some of these things. And I found that Lee Strobel's book was really helpful, partly because it's a readable book. Lee Strobel is a journalist, and he's a very good writer. Now, saying that he's a journalist, I should also mention that he's obviously not a Jesus scholar himself. But he does good work in this book where he interviews some important Jesus scholars as well as some important Christian apologists to give you a good background for why we believe in Jesus. This book is not only about the resurrection, it's about many of the different claims that we believe about Christ. Another book that is similar to Lee Strobel's book, also very readable, also very good, is J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity. Now, Wallace is a homicide detective. So he takes some of his skills that he has from being a detective, and he applies those skills to investigating some of the claims of the four Gospels. So that's also a good work. But if you're looking for something specifically on the resurrection, a good introduction for the resurrection, I don't know of any other better book than Gary Habermas's and Mike Licona's book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Now, one of the things that makes this a really good book is not just the information that's in it, but the way that the information is presented. So it's presented in such a way that it makes it easy to remember some of the historical details. Also, it makes it easy for you to communicate those historical details to somebody else who might be curious about the reason for the hope that's within us. So these are some good introductions. If you're looking for something that is more scholarly, and you want something even more in depth than those introductions, then I would recommend these four works. And each of them have their own strengths and potentially weaknesses to them, but we'll just say that they have different strengths, and they kind of give you a good picture of why it's rational for Christians to believe in the resurrection. So Mike Licona's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, is an exhaustive apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus. It's about 700 pages long, so you need to know that going into it. But really, Licona does a great job just covering almost any objection that you could think of for why somebody wouldn't believe in the resurrection, and I think he's very effective at answering those objections. N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, is also very good. This is especially good if you want to get more information about what the Jews believed about resurrection and how that applies to the evidence of Jesus' resurrection. So I recommend this book as well. It's a foundational book for studying this topic. And then William Lane Craig's book, The Sun Rises. This is an excellent book. It's much shorter than the first two, Licona's book and Wright's book. But it's based off of a in-depth scholarship that Craig has been engaged in for most of his academic career. And so I would recommend some of his other academic works, but he has two huge volumes on the resurrection that are very, very good, but they also cost over $100, so I wouldn't feel right necessarily recommending them here. But I think if you get his book, The Sun Rises, you'll have a good background in Craig's approach to the resurrection. And then I have Richard Swinburne's book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate. Now, this is for those of you who really like probability theory, specifically Bayesian probability theory. Swinburne has a unique approach to giving the reasons for why we believe in the resurrection. So if you like that, I recommend Swinburne's book as well. Okay, so what are the evidences that we can give for the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to, in this video, just look at 3 historical facts that are compelling for me. We need to look at these 3 facts together and reflect for a moment on what the best explanation is for these 3 facts. And the first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion. And I'll give you just here in a moment, I'll give you some reasons for why we believe that Jesus not only lived, but how we know about the crucifixion of Jesus. But this is a historical fact. Most scholars who study Jesus agree that Jesus not only existed, but he died by crucifixion. The second historical fact is that after Jesus' crucifixion, his disciples believed in him. And specifically, his disciples believed that he was the Jewish Messiah. And so we'll look at this historical fact and how it builds a case for the resurrection. And then third, after Jesus died by crucifixion, 3 days later he rose from the dead. Well, how do we know that? The third historical fact is that the tomb of Jesus, where he was buried, was empty. And so we'll just briefly look at these 3 facts, starting with the crucifixion. So why do we think that Jesus actually was crucified in the first century Greco-Roman world under Pontius Pilate? Well, this is a very good question for us to think about because it actually gets us to think about how we might know anything about antiquity. Now, if you are an archaeologist, a historian, which I'm neither of those, I'm a philosopher, but I've read enough from archaeologists and historians to have a basic background on how they get the information that they get. And when it comes to ancient history, there are basically 3 sources of knowledge for how we know anything about the past. If you want to learn about what happened in the first century Greco-Roman world, you might have ancient ruins. So you come across ancient Corinth and you find ruins there. And this gives you evidence for sure that people used to live there. But if you want to know what did these people believe, what was their daily life like, what was their diet like, well then you need to get a second source of information, and this might include ancient artifacts. So you might dig up some potteries, you might dig up some coins, you might notice that there are burial tombs, ossuaries, and these give you more information about what these people might have believed, what their daily life might have looked like. And just to give you an example, let's say we dig up a coin. Well, that gives you information about how they exchange money. They use coins. But then if you pick up a coin and you notice that there's a picture of someone on the coin, well, this raises more questions. Who is the image of this person that's on a coin, any particular coin? Well, if you're looking at this coin and you see a Greek inscription on it that says Caesar, well, you have a little bit more information. You know whoever's on this coin is most likely Caesar. That would be a good inference that you can make. But who is this Caesar? How would you get more information about this person who is on these ancient artifacts? Well, to get more information, you need texts. And in fact, when you consider the coin with a face on it, with the inscription Caesar, really the way that you would know that the picture was somebody named Caesar is the text that's on the coin. Well, how are you going to get more texts? If you want to get an abundance of texts, eventually you need to start having documents. So ancient documents become really important to knowing things about ancient history. And I want to say this from the get-go because when I was in college and I started looking into these things, I had some of my more skeptical friends who would ask me questions like, what hard archaeological evidence is there that Jesus even existed? And at the time, I didn't quite know how to answer that because I was thinking, well, I need to find an artifact that shows that Jesus existed, or I needed to dig up some tangible fact. And then it dawned on me, when I was in seminary, I was taking a course in Greco-Roman history, that the information that we have about historical figures comes from ancient documents. So what's the hard evidence that Jesus actually existed? The answer is that we have important ancient documents that give us information about a historical person named Jesus of Nazareth. That's how we know that Jesus existed. And so the most important of these documents come from documents that we have in the New Testament, So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are probably our most important sources that we have about Jesus, at least about the broad life of Jesus. Now we could look at other texts in the New Testament to get more information about Jesus as well. But these are the narratives about Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these are four independent sources. And one of the reasons why we know this is if you read these sources next to each other, one of the things that you'll notice is that even though the stories about the crucifixion of Jesus all give us the same information that Jesus was crucified, some of the details in the stories differ slightly. Now, one of the conclusions that we can get from this is that if these stories differ in some of the details, that means that Matthew wasn't just copying Mark's story, otherwise the details would be perfectly the same. Luke didn't copy Mark's story either. Now, there are some places where you can see some overlap, but if there's differences in details, that gives us reasons to believe that there's four independent accounts of the crucifixion. Now, are there any other sources outside of this? Yes, there are several sources outside of this that gives us information about the crucifixion. I'm just going to name a few that are outside the New Testament. In Tacitus's work, he mentions the crucifixion of Jesus. Josephus does as well. We have it also in the Jewish Talmud. And in the works of Marabar Serapion, we have information about the crucifixion of Jesus. So just to give you one sample of what a text might look like outside the New Testament, in Tacitus's work, the Annals, he writes, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So here is a text outside the New Testament that gives us information about somebody named Christus, and he suffered under Pontius Pilate. And so because we have a number of documents, independent documents, that tell us about this historical event, scholars for the most part do not question whether or not Jesus was crucified. The scholar, New Testament scholar Christopher Bryan writes this, Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. That, as a matter of history, is just about as certain as anything in antiquity. Likewise, Bart Ehrman, who is not a Christian New Testament scholar, he's an agnostic New Testament scholar, he writes in his book, Did Jesus Exist? Virtually all scholars agree that Jesus was a Jewish man, a preacher and a teacher, was crucified in Jerusalem when Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. So this is a historical event that virtually all scholars agree is a historical fact. But of course, you might ask the question, how does the crucifixion of Jesus provide evidence for his resurrection? And that's a really good question to ask. And to understand the answer that I would give to this question, I think it's important for us to go to the next historical fact, and that is, after the crucifixion of Jesus, his disciples believed that he was the Messiah. And we also know this historical fact from a number of sources. So one example would be Acts 5:33 through 42. We'll just read a portion of this here. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they, meaning the disciples, did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. Now I want to take a moment just to look at this phrase, the Christ is Jesus. When I was a kid, and I remember as a kid going to church, learning about Jesus Christ, I always assumed as a kid, and maybe many people have assumed this, I always assumed that Jesus was the first name and Christ was the last name. Just like my name is Mike Burhow, so Jesus is Jesus Christ. It was a new thing that I found out when I got to college, that Christ was not a last name, but Christ was actually a title. And the title Christ is really the title Messiah. So when the disciples were believing after the crucifixion, specifically what they were believing is that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, the reason why this is important is because this was a foolish belief from their perspective. They were Jewish disciples, and this makes no sense from a theological perspective, and this makes no sense from the perspective that messiahs are not supposed to be people that are crucified. And so you read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul says this: we preach Christ crucified. So again, this just gives you information about what the disciples believed, what they preached. They preached Christ crucified. But now this is a strange, strange belief. And Paul notes that it's a strange belief. He says it's a stumbling block to Jews and it's folly to Gentiles. Now, why would this be a stumbling block to Jews? And why is this important from thinking about this from the perspective of a Jewish disciple? Well, if you go back to the Jewish scriptures, Deuteronomy chapter 21, we read this: if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and you hang him on a tree, you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. Now, we need to stop for a moment and just consider the Jewish context here. And we need to consider the context of the first century Greco-Roman world. So this is the context that Jesus is entering into. If somebody is going to come along and claim to be the Messiah, and if this person is going to gather a group of disciples, then we need to ask, what is the job description for this Messiah? What is this Messiah going to do? Well, if you read the Jewish story, the job description is clear. You go back to the book of Exodus, and Moses is sort of like a Messiah-type figure. And what Moses does is he leads the people of Israel out of captivity. They were in captivity by the Egyptians, leads them out of captivity. The Egyptian army follows them, and if God is with you, God will part the Red Sea. They walk through on dry land. The people of Israel walk through on dry land, and the Egyptian army fails to capture the Jewish people because God is with them. If you read the story, you have somebody like David, who David is not supposed to be Goliath. I mean, Goliath is huge. David is small. But when God's with you, David can beat Goliath. Or you have Samson, and he has a jawbone, and he beats 1,000 Philistines. That is not something that's supposed to happen, but when God's with you, it happens. So these Jewish disciples were expecting a Messiah like that. They were not expecting a Messiah who would be crucified. This is a stumbling block to the Jews because they read the Jewish story. The Messiah wins. The Messiah beats the Egyptian army. The Messiah beats the Philistines. The Messiah beats Goliath. And furthermore, if the Messiah is defeated and hung on a tree, what we know theologically is that this person was not the Messiah. This person was actually cursed by God, and Messiahs are not cursed by God. And so if we sum this up, historically speaking, Jesus was actually not the first person to come along and gather a group of disciples and have a bunch of people think that maybe this is the Messiah. There were people that came before Jesus. There were people that came after Jesus who had a Messiah-like movement. But every time the Romans confronted them, that movement stopped because the Romans were very good at crucifying criminals. They were very good at crucifying would-be messiahs. And in every case, when these Messiah figures were crucified, the disciples fled because this is evidence that this cannot be the Messiah. A real Messiah will not be crucified because a hanged man is cursed by God. And so we need to ask the question, why is it that these Jewish disciples would believe that Jesus was the Messiah when they had theological, scriptural proof that he wasn't? And so now, think about it. The first fact is Jesus was crucified. After the crucifixion, his disciples believed that he was truly the Messiah. Why would they believe that? And this is where we start thinking through some of the earliest convictions that the disciples preached. If we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have what is sometimes referred to as the earliest Christian creed. So there are many scholars that date this back anywhere from AD 35 to AD 40. And one of the reasons why we know this is a creed is because there's language here. So Paul writes, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. So the statement, I delivered to you what I received, when you couple those together, that's signifying that what's coming after this is a creed. And it's most likely an oral creed that's been recited, that most Christians would have been familiar with. And scholars date this creed all the way back to AD 35 to somewhere AD 40, somewhere in that range. And so what is this earliest Christian creed? Well, this is what we have recorded for us. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day. So now if we ask, why would the disciples believe that Jesus was the Messiah? Here's what his disciples preached. Here's what the early creed was of these disciples. That after the Messiah died, he didn't stay dead. He was raised on the third day. That's the claim that they're making. That's what they're preaching. But the creed goes on, and it says that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. So now we have more about what the disciples believed from their earliest creed. So they believe that Jesus died on the cross. The Messiah died. Now, why would they believe that the Messiah was crucified? Because on the third day he rose from the dead. So that was another part of their belief. But then the third part of their belief is that he appeared to many. So Jesus died by crucifixion, raised on the third day, appeared to many. Therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. That was at least the claim that the disciples were making. So if Jesus died by crucifixion, if somebody who's hung on a tree is cursed by God, if the disciples believed that this person who hung on a tree that we should be thinking was cursed by God believes, if we ask why do they believe that, this is the reason that they gave historically. And so there's no reason to not think that this is what the disciples believed. In fact, Bart Ehrman again says, historians have no difficulty whatsoever speaking about the belief in Jesus' resurrection, since this is a matter of public record. So we know historically that the disciples believed in Jesus' resurrection. And so now we could ask the question, well, what is the best explanation for the origin of these beliefs? Why is it that the disciples would believe that Jesus died, he was the Messiah, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to many people? Why would they believe all of that? And here I think the issue of worldview comes into play. So if you're a naturalist, and a naturalist is somebody who believes, in the words of Carl Sagan, the universe is all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. We can never have a supernatural explanation for anything. God doesn't exist and God doesn't intervene in human history. If you're approaching this from a naturalist perspective, then you would maybe have one of these theories that you see on the screen. So the swoon theory is this idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. The hallucination theory is that the people who had appearances of Jesus didn't really see the real Jesus, they just hallucinated Jesus. Or there's been a theory out there that Jesus actually had an unknown twin brother. So maybe that would be a naturalistic explanation. Or you could just be agnostic and say, I don't know what the explanation is for the origin of these beliefs. I just know that Jesus rising from the dead is not a good explanation. Well, if you're a naturalist who's committed to these ideas, then these are the only options that you have. From a theistic perspective, I don't think these explanations hold water. And one of the reasons is because if we go to the third fact, these explanations, these naturalistic explanations, just don't hold up. And that is the fact of the empty tomb. Now, I should state just for a moment that this particular fact has been far more debated than the first two. That said, I think there are many good reasons to think that Jesus left an empty tomb after the crucifixion, and I'm going to give you just one reason why we think that the tomb was empty, and that reason comes from when we look at the early creed that we've already looked at, and we compare it to what we have in the four Gospels. Now, if we go back to that early creed that was developed at the latest, probably AD 40, we see that in this early Christian creed, Jesus died by crucifixion and that Jesus was buried, and then that the appearances were to men. That's all that the creed mentions. But now what's interesting, when you look at the four Gospels, and one of the things that's important to note about the four Gospels is that the four Gospels all come after this creed. They're written far later than this early Christian creed. So the four Gospels are written between AD 65 to 95, give or take a few years, Mark probably being the earliest of these Gospels, John being the latest of these Gospels. Now remember, these four accounts are all independent sources, and when you look at the tomb story, again, all four of these sources have different details in the four stories, and that has caused people like Bart Ehrman to say, well, this can't be inspired scripture. And that's a question for another time, whether or not contradictions or whether there's contradictions between these books. That's something that we can treat at a later moment. But as a historian looking at this, if there's differences in the details from these books, again, that means you have different historical accounts of the same event. Now, one of the things that you find in all four of these Gospels is that after Jesus' death, he was buried in a tomb, and the first appearances were to women, not to men. And this brings up a really important question. Why do the later stories start with appearances to women? Why is it that the earliest creed only gives us the appearances that Jesus has to men, whereas the later stories, the four Gospels, start with appearances to women? And the best answer, from my perspective, is because that's what actually happened. And one of the reasons why I think that's the best explanation is because if you look historically, women were not respected in this culture. So in the works of Josephus, Josephus writes, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted, since it is probable that they may not speak truth, either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment." And so Josephus is saying in that culture, now we don't have to agree with that culture, and I don't think we should agree with that culture, but in that culture, they did not respect the testimony of women. Or in the Jewish Talmud, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. So again, we go back to the question, why is it then that the later Gospels begin with appearances to women? Well, I think the only thing that explains that historically is because that's what happened. And if that's what happened, the story of the tomb being empty has at least good reason for thinking that that story is a historical event that took place. Because you have four independent sources that all gave the same detail about the appearances to women, and that provides good evidence for thinking that the tomb was, in fact, empty. So again, I said that I was going to give a brief look at the historical evidence for Jesus. This is, again, not exhaustive. If you want more information, I recommend going back to the beginning of this video and looking at those sources, looking them up. But I think that there is good, compelling reasons to believe that on the third day, after the crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus rose physically, bodily from the dead.